Hey, Mike with Nerd Problems Gaming here. In today's video, we'll be doing a review and how to play video on the board game Evolution, so let's get into it. Alright, so now that we got the game out, let's walk you through how to set up the game and how to play so you have a better idea on how the game works, and then I'll jump into my full review after that. So really, the essence of Evolution is a survival game, and players will have to build species and evolve them with various different traits, all while competing for food resources to become the player at the end of the game to earn the most points. And so how you earn points is by overall food collected throughout the game, the population size of your various species, and the number of trait cards on your surviving species. And so you'll add that up in total, and whoever has the most points at the end of the game will win the game. And the game ends when there's not enough cards in the draw pile to deal out the starting cards at the beginning of the turn for every player. Now the game itself isn't super long to play. In most two-player games I play, it takes about 30 to 40 minutes to play the game. And so if you add more players, just understand it'll probably take a little bit longer. Also, as we go through this example game, we'll be playing as if it was two players. The rules are basically the same. Just at the start of the game, you're going to set aside 40 cards and remove them from the game. And then also, when it comes to adding traits to cards, in a two-player game, you can only add 2 traits per card, where any size game above that, you can have 3 traits per card. So when it comes to setup of the game, it's very simple. You're going to give each player a species board, each with their own square token for each slot. So a green for the population size or a brown for the body size. Have each player set their cubes in the first slot on each species board. You can give each player a food screen, and this just hides the number of food that you might have during your turns. Set out all the food to the side of the watering hole. Make sure the species boards are easily accessible, and then randomly decide which player will be the first player, and you can simply give them the first player token after that. At this point, the game is played through various different phases or rounds, and there's multiple steps during each round, and so we'll walk you through how those work as well. So the first part of the game is you're going to deal out 3 cards plus 1 for each of the species boards each player has. So for example, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 to start the game. Alright, now that each player has their hand, each player is going to select 1 card that they want to contribute to the watering hole, and that's going to add to the food supply. So you can look at the bottom right corner of each card and see how much each card is worth for food. So again, most of them are positive, but you will have this occasional negative food source, and that will actually remove that many food from the watering hole. And so food can stay around between multiple rounds if it isn't all removed. Or again, depending on if you maybe have carnivores in your species that eat other animals, you might not need plant food, so you might use negatives to sabotage other players. Kind of all plays into the strategy. But early on, starting off, you're probably going to contribute something for food. So let's say I take this 4, and I'll put it face down. The next player will look at their hand and see what they want to contribute. In this case, let's do the 7. Now at this point, players have the option to play cards and activate various abilities. So how this works is you'll play whatever cards you want face down underneath your species card. And that species will then adapt that new trait. And so again, as a reminder, in a 2-player game, you can have up to 2 traits per species. But in a 3-player game and higher, you can have up to 3 cards per species card. Now another option that you can do is you can actually discard a card, and when you discard a card, it gives you various different abilities. So one, I could get a new species from the species supply, and I would need to place that either to the left or right of my current species, and then I would grab a couple of tokens from the token pile, and then place one in the first position for population size and the first position for body size. And now I have a new species board on the table. Another option I could do is I could discard a card, and I could increase either the body size by 1 or the population size by 1. Now, something to keep in mind is that when we get to the food sources stage, each species will need to be completely fed up to its population size, and if they aren't, you'll need to bring that population down because they weren't able to feed that many of their species. Another thing to consider as well is that body size can impact whether this species can be attacked by carnivores. So if your body size is bigger than the body size of an opposing carnivore, that carnivore would not be able to attack this species. Now, another thing to consider as well is that if a species is attacked by a carnivore, the carnivore will gain meat equal to the size of the body, and then that population will go down by 1 notch. If a species loses its final population, it's removed from the game. If there happened to be a species in between, the two would merge together, and then you would redraw cards depending on how many trait cards were on the species board. But again, that's a little bit ahead of myself, but those are the different options you can do at this phase when it comes to playing cards. You also don't need to play every card from your hand. You can save some for later turns if you choose to, but once all players have played the card traits they want, discarded cards that they want, they will both reveal them simultaneously, and then you'll move on to revealing the food cards. So at this point, both players will reveal the food cards in the middle. So in this case, we've got 7 and 4, so 11 food needs to go in the middle. These become discarded. So now there's 11 food in the middle. Now, players may have a species with a trait that has a card with this symbol. If this is present, this ability is going to activate before players will start feeding from the watering hole. So in this long neck card, for example, a species would take 1 plant food from the food bank, which is the giant pile of food over here outside of the watering hole, and then they would place that on their card. Another card like fertile, for example, would indicate that the species gains 1 population if there's food in the watering hole before the food cards are revealed. So if your species had that and there was food in the middle, you could bring up their population by 1 for free. Again, there's other cards that you could place on your various different species. Some will protect species that are next to them or affect cards that are next to them. You'll see that with the arrow on the top. That just indicates if a species is to the right of the creature in this case, or in this case, if there is a creature on the right or the left, it would be affected by this card. There's other cards like the carnivore that would transform your species into a carnivore, and if that's the case, they would then not be able to eat food from the watering hole, but would instead attack other species to gain food. This also includes your own species, and if a carnivore is hungry, they have to eat. So they will attack their own species to get full if you aren't able to attack the opposing player's species. Again, various different cards you'll find that you can play on your creatures. I won't go into any more detail on the specific trait cards, as they're pretty self-explanatory, but if you do have additional questions, you can consult the rulebook and they go into each card individually further. Moving on from there, players will enter the feeding phase. And so how this works, players will move along, starting with the first player with their first player token. They can choose to feed one of their species. So in this case, this species could take 1 food from the watering hole. It would then move on to the next player where they could feed their species from food from the watering hole, and it would go on until all of the animals are full. If there's any remaining food in the watering hole, it will stay there until next round. Again, during this time, if you happen to have a species that was a carnivore, that carnivore could attack any species that it had a bigger body size than, or that wasn't protected by some trait cards that might be in play on the table. And again, like I mentioned, when they feed, they will gain meat food from the food bank in proportion to the body size of the creature they were attacking. Once this is complete, players will take their food tokens and place them hidden from the other player behind their food shield. It will then move on to the next round where cards are dealt out, and again, everyone will get 3 cards plus 1 for each species board they have in front of them. So in this case, this player would get 5 cards and this player would get 4 cards. And then the same process would continue of selecting food to contribute to the watering hole, playing cards from your hand to give species new traits, to upgrade their population or body size, or to acquire new species from the species board pile. Again, from there, you would activate any of the cards that happen before revealing the food. You'll reveal the food cards, add the appropriate food to the watering hole, and then players will take turn feeding their multiple species, starting with the now first player token over here. And so again, play will continue back and forth, going through these different rounds and phases until at the beginning of the draw phase, there isn't enough cards in the stack to deal out the appropriate number of cards to each player based on their number of species boards. Or the game will also end if a species goes extinct and that player needs to draw a number of cards from the draw pile based on the traits that were attached to that extinct species, and there isn't enough in the pile, causing the discard pile to be reshuffled. The game would then end after the end of that round. Now when it comes to scoring, it's very simple. You'll count up the number of food tokens that you've collected as a player. Each of those will be worth 1 point. Each surviving species will gain points based on the population size. So in this example, this would be worth 1 point and this would be worth 1 point. On top of that, for each trait card on a species, you'll gain 1 point for that as well. So I would gain an additional point for this species card on this species. At that point, it's simply the player that has the most points is the winner. And if there's a tie, the player with the most trait cards is the winner. And if there's still a tie, the player with the most population points in total is the winner. But overall, that's really the basics on how you play Evolution. If you have any questions, feel free to drop a comment in the comments below, or check out the rule book as they go into greater detail on all of the cards and more specifics on rules if you do have questions. But now that you have a better idea on how the game works, let's jump into my review. Well, now that you have a better idea on how the game works, how do I actually feel about it? So there's definitely a lot to like about this game. I know for me, the first thing that really jumps out is the colorful artwork within the game. There's all kinds of unique trait cards within the game with dazzling artwork. Another thing that really jumps out at me is the replay value of the game. I feel like every single time you play the game, it's a completely unique experience. There's a ton of different trait cards to choose from within the game, and each playthrough is never really the same as a previous one. Sometimes you might focus on a plant-eating strategy, sometimes it might be a carnivore strategy, sometimes you need to adapt based on what the other players are doing. Maybe you have a strategy where you're attacking your own creatures to get a lot of meat, or maybe you're using a cooperative strategy where every time one of your species grabs a piece of food, they get to share it with others, and the list goes on and on. I also like that the game isn't very hard to learn, since it's broken down into phases where you're simply just drawing cards, planning how many food resources you want to contribute to the watering hole, and then playing traits and evolving species, and simply just switching off who goes first. There's not a lot to it in the sense of things to learn, but I definitely think the strategy can get quite complex, and you might be planning several turns ahead, but at the same time, you might need to change your strategy in the moment depending on what other players do. I like that the game doesn't take very long to play as well. Most games I found when playing 2-player ended up taking around 30 to 40 minutes. Now I don't really feel like playing with more players than that is really going to impact the game time that much, just in the fact that everyone is sharing all of the trait cards, and the game ends when everyone can't draw anymore. And so since that's a limited resource as you play the game, it might only take 15 or 20 minutes longer if you're playing with more players. I also think the game scales really well, even if you're playing a 2-player game or a 3-player or 4-player or more, and so that's great to see. Sometimes when you play board games with a different number of players, it really alters how you play the game and the feel of it, but I think this game plays well as a 2-player version or with more players as well. The game also does have several expansions, so if you like this base game, you can get other expansions to expand the replay value further, but even this base game I think has an extensive replay value to the game because every single time you play is a totally unique experience, and there's a lot of different strategies you can test out in hopes of getting the most points at the end of the game. Overall, it's definitely one of my top 2-player board games, and I definitely recommend it. But let me know in the comments below if you've played Evolution yet. Have you tried any of the expansions of the game? How do you feel about it? Do you think it looks cool? If you do and you want to pick up a copy, there'll be a link in the description below as well where you can do that. But if you guys like this video, be sure to smash that like button as it really helps out the channel. And if you like videos like this on video games, board games, and everything nerdy, definitely check out one of our other videos here. And if you haven't done so yet, be sure to subscribe and turn on the bell notifications to get the latest updates of new nerd videos we put out. But once again, thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you more soon.